Awesome. So thanks everyone for coming along to today's Content UK session. Very excited to be having Robbie Swale on, leadership coach, and he's going to be talking all about how to use habits to achieve ambitious goals. And I've personally been working with Robbie over the last few months because I was feeling a bit unclear with my own goals and values and getting overwhelmed quite regularly. And Robbie's helped me a lot over the last few months. So quite excited for him to share some of his teachings with you all today. So yeah, he's a leadership coach. He also facilitates coaching sessions with companies like Moonpig, the Royal Opera House, has a podcast, has just written a book recently, published a book recently called The 12-Minute Method, which I'm sure he'll talk about shortly as well. And in terms of the format for this session, so I'll pass over to Robbie in a sec, where he'll do a short presentation. And then I'll ask some of my own questions and any that you have as well. So if you've got questions for Robbie as he talks, just post them in the chat and I'll put them forward to him after his presentation. And there's also a deal where you can get a copy of his next book as well for Content UK members that we'll share details about afterwards. Cool, enough from me. I'll hand over to you, Robbie.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, it's great to be here. And like we got a question in advance actually, which actually made me add in an extra slide to the presentation. I've got a few slides, which I'll show you now, which I was just saying to Christina before. I have this practice that when someone cancels on me, I started this a few years ago. I used to get really, really angry and upset when people didn't show up, especially if they canceled at late notice. So to try and deal with that, I decided that every time someone canceled on me, I would try and do something cool. So it wouldn't just be go straight into my email. It would be like, pick something that I wouldn't normally make the time to do and do it. And someone canceled on me, but actually showed up really late on Friday. And so what I did was I made this slide. I was saying to Christina, my wife has really swish slides and I always admire them and think, why do my slides look so rubbish? And then I realized she just has a template, which she types a few words or puts a picture into, and it looks cool. So I made this template based on the branding that I kind of accidentally got when my book came out, which is a funny thing about that. Like, you know, someone designs a cover for your book, and then of course that can be branding. So yeah, excuse me. So yeah, Christina's introduced me already, but to say a tiny bit more about me, I've been coaching professionally for about 7 years. And the way I think about my work at the moment is there's kind of 3 parts to it. So I love working with people, often leaders or entrepreneurs, on essentially, sometimes people feel like that and we'll talk maybe a bit about this in a minute, to kind of achieve the success that they want, they have to compromise who they are, or they have to kind of play a game or play the politics that they don't really like. And I love working with people to work out how that doesn't have to be the case, how we can have ambitious goals and not have to compromise who we are to reach them. I'm also really interested in the craft of coaching. I have a podcast for coaches called The Coach's Journey. So if you know anyone who else is a coach, tell them about it and they'll be very grateful to you. And I have a piece of work, a whole set of resources for coaches, because I think that the craft of coaching has something really important to offer the world. And then the final part of my work that I'm really interested in is creativity. And essentially the bit of that I'm interested in is, why do we sometimes have dreams or goals and we kind of know what they are, but we don't do anything about them? And really habits, or, for me, one habit, which showed me lots of things, is how I have worked through that challenge for myself. And that's really what my book is about, what the other books in that 12-minute method series will be about too. Yeah, and I'm just going to talk for a few minutes and tell some stories, but do chuck questions in the chat as we go and that kind of thing too. Let me just check if I can still, I've still got the chat, great. And then we'll do some questions at the end as well. And my aim is just to make sure, is to try and share some stories that might inspire or unlock things for you, some tools and tasks that you could actually do. I've got a couple of questions about how you might want to start creating a habit that will really support you too. And so we'll just see where we go. So the first thing that I think is worth talking about is how, this is one of the chapters in How to Start When You're Stuck, which is my first book, how our sense of what's possible doesn't always work. And there's 2 ways that I've seen this. So I saw this when I first really worked with a professional coach back in 2016. He asked me this throwaway question at the bottom of our intake questionnaire, his intake questionnaire, which was, what's the impossible goal for this coaching engagement? And for me, maybe this was the second engagement that we did, but in 6 months' time, it'd be like amazing if I'd left my work and I was doing part-time work, part-time coaching at the time, and I was just coaching full-time. And it was genuinely gobsmacking to me that at the end of those 6 months, I was in that position. In fact, I got there after 4 of the 6 months, and it had felt impossible at the start of the engagement, and it was done. And that was the first real emphasis to me of something that I then began to see with clients. Now, it doesn't always happen, but what I noticed is if you stretch people's imagination and sense of what's possible, more is possible than they think. So I'd sometimes ask a client, what would have to happen in this coaching engagement for something for it to feel extraordinary at the end? And again, sometimes these things would happen. And sometimes I ask that about a coaching session. And again, sometimes they would happen. And it's not every time, but it's that sometimes things that feel extraordinary or impossible actually can happen much more quickly than we think. That then in some ways was what this is a quote, which is one of those quotes that's attributed to lots of people. And I've tried to stop incorrectly quoting things. I made this decision last year because I was quoting Einstein quite a lot, and I thought I better check it. And turned out he hadn't said any of the things that I was quoting him as saying, or he had said one of them, but it was said in a really obscure physicist way, which people had then made into like a pithy one sentence thing. So some people attribute this to Tony Robbins, some to Bill Gates. When I did some Googling, it looked like it was somebody else, but today this is just me. I've written this morning as the way to phrase this. So we tend to overestimate what we can achieve in small amounts of time and underestimate what we're capable of in the long term. And it's not always the case. Like I said, sometimes we underestimate what we're capable of in an hour in a coaching session as well. But the first part, overestimating what we can achieve in small amounts of time, that's why we don't finish our to-do lists. Or why yesterday I said to my wife, I've just got 10 minutes of work to do, then I'll have a shower, then I'll come and help with our daughter. And I came back later and she said, that was a long 10 minutes. And I didn't even realize I'd just done the task and it had taken me 25. And there you go. And then we underestimate what's possible in the long term. And that is part of what I want to share today, that there's this chance for us to reframe time and timescales to feel like anything is possible. That's really what's happened to me over the last few years. It's a really weird thing to say. It's like, it sounds a bit crazy and coachy, doesn't it? But my a habit, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, has made the future look really different. And if you want to think about underestimating what we're capable of in the long term, it's like in a decade, you could do a new bachelor's degree, a master's, and a PhD. So you could become a PhD level expert in anything in a decade. And we never think that that's a thing that we could do, but it is possible. So I guess the lesson or the thought here that I want to catch before I move on to the next slide is, sometimes things don't take as long as you think. Sometimes what feels impossible for a 6-month period of time can happen in 4. And then the invitation from me in this, which is to avoid the kind of one of the risks that I'm going to talk about in a sec of ambition, is to dream big and then focus on the small steps. That's essentially the message of this little talk that I'm going to give. Then we had this great question, which I don't actually have in front of me now, which was something about how do we balance the stresses of expectations and ambition with wanting to have a balanced life? And that made me want to put this slide in, and then I had to find an image for it. And if you want to have a strange time, look at the images of swords on Pixabay, which is like a free image platform. strange pictures of swords, and lots of people having a lot of fun creating kind of fantasy fan art. Great stuff. So there's a few things we want to be careful of with goal setting. In fact, I was just remembering just before we started the call today that I think I heard that there's some research that says that actually goal setting is not that helpful for us, and that we should think instead. So as a coach, for example, I shouldn't be asking people what are their goals. I should be asking people more open and less time-bound things like, what are your dreams? Because when we get into the goal setting and ambition, we sometimes get into a kind of sense of lack. So a sense of, until I've achieved this goal, I'm a failure. Or I'll be happy when I've achieved this ambition. And we have to be really careful of that. Like if you're doing your goal in order to be happy, I would suggest focusing on being happy instead, because we don't want too many people perhaps think that that's what's going to happen, that the goal that they've got, the level of success that they want to achieve will make them happy, and then get there and find that it won't. One of the other big risks with holding too tightly to our goals or ambitions is we might miss other things along. So if we're tied really tightly to a definition of success or a particular goal, we might miss other things that would serve us just, in the way that would meet what we think the need of the goal is. Or wait a minute, let me get that right. So we might think the goal will meet a particular need, but if we're too tightly attached to that goal or that ambition, we might miss the chance to meet the need we want to meet in another way. So I guess I want to say that as part of the double-edged sword of ambition And then I want to kind of offer two frames to really carefully think about goals, because that question we got, made me think, well, actually having a really nicely balanced life, that's quite an ambitious goal. Like a lot of people want that and don't have it. And so we shouldn't think that ambition is only, I don't know, these external focused goals that we kind of do have a bit of an online culture, don't we, about like, hustling and I don't know, like high achievers, high potential, all that stuff. And we just need to be really careful about that. And one of my mentors, Robert, he always asks, what is success to you? And then when someone answers, he asks, what is real success? With italics and underlined on the word real. It usually takes us down to another level of, what really matters to us in the situation. And another way to do that, I'd really recommend everyone does this. If you've got a goal, so take the goal and then ask yourself, if I achieve that goal, what do I get that's more important than the goal itself? So let's say there's a new career move that is the goal or the ambition. Okay, if I get that promotion, what do I get that's more important than the promotion itself? And then you might say, well, I get like a sense of, or I get the recognition I deserve. That feels more likely to me. And then you might ask, okay, well, if I get the recognition I deserve, what do I get that's more important than getting the recognition? And then you might answer, what would it be? It would be like, well, I'll finally feel like I don't have to strive anymore. And that's a really different thing to getting a promotion. And you can dig into that as much as you like. But I really recommend that as a way to avoid the double-edged sword of ambition. So that is, if I get this outcome, what do I get that's even more important than that outcome? And then when you've got that answer, ask it again and do it at least three to 5 times is a good amount of digging to do with that question. Another really important thing to do when we think about ambitions is to build a complete picture. So don't build a work only piece. Remember to include the other things that are important to you, whatever they are. And a really nice exercise that I love to share with people is one that came off the Tim Ferriss show. So Christina and I were talking about the risks of us all having read the same books and watched the same podcasts. And I know that, I think, Christina, you've followed Tim Ferriss a bit too. Probably my favorite episode of his podcast is with the brand expert, Debbie Millman. And she shares this amazing thing called the 10-year plan for a remarkable life. If you Google Debbie Millman's 10-year plan for a remarkable life, then you'll find some really great, people will have put that up for you. But it's essentially to describe your ideal average day from the minute you wake up to the minute you fall asleep in as much detail as you can. And wonderful things emerged from that, a bit by surprise. I had a client once who, only when she opened the doors on her plan for a remarkable life did she realize she didn't want to, the curtains rather, did she realize she didn't want to be living in London in 5 or 10 years. And now she doesn't, and it's wonderful to see that. I saw an update from her recently. And the great thing about that is it creates this whole person picture of what ambition and goals really mean for you. It means we're not missing out on anything important, right? We're capturing what exactly do we want life to be like in 5 or 10 years. And then we have to hold it lightly. So then that's when the shift is needed. So with my coaching clients, we'll start by creating a vision for our work together, but we don't come back to it every time, right? Then we do the work on whatever's present and we see where we get to, and then we come back to it in halfway through or 3/4 of the way through. And that's holding this vision and ambition for our work lightly. And Debbie Millman says, just read your plan for a remarkable life once a year. And that's enough. And like one of mine has just expired 5 years after I wrote it. It's remarkable what's happened. And I've only read it once a year, but it's been in me. Once you've got into the detail of your ambition, then it's inside you. And then I want to talk a little bit about, so then there's probably one more thread for me that has been important in thinking about this move from the high level goals that I've had into the habits. And the move came because I read The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. It's an amazing book about creative battles and procrastination and what he calls resistance, which is his universal force that holds us back from the things that really matter to us. And one of the things he says is the place where you feel the most resistance is most important to your soul's evolution. So the thing you procrastinate on or worry about the most could be the most important thing to your soul's evolution. And in about 2016, I was working with Joel, the coach who I mentioned before, and I was feeling a huge amount of resistance to sharing things online. And partly I knew that I wanted to be more public, because I was really just moving into my coaching business. And I knew I wanted to be able to post things online, and I was interested in writing. But I also had read that thing in The War of Art that, the things that are most important to us are where we feel the most resistance. And I didn't want to feel like I felt every time. It wasn't just articles, really. At the time I got hugely wrapped up about even posting jokes on Facebook. Like, it was, when I think back, it was really unpleasant. And so I wanted to work my way through that as a human, because I didn't want my plan for a remarkable life did not include worrying a lot about whether to post something on Facebook. So to get through this, Joel and I designed a little practice where I would write while I was on the train. And this is a picture of the first time I did this practice. This is the first time on the platform at Clapham Junction in Southwest London. And I got the train to Waterloo 3 times a week about that time, through there and back. And I said I would do 1 a day each time I went into work. So I was part-time coaching, part-time working in the next 2 weeks. So I would write while the train was moving, stop when it stopped, proofread it once, and post it online. And I did that 5 times, and I posted it on LinkedIn because I thought no one really read LinkedIn. And it didn't feel nice, but it kind of did feel good. It's a bit like working out. Like, I never really want to do a hard workout, but at the end, I kind of know it was a good thing for me. I never really want to go for a long run before I leave. That's not quite true. I sometimes do, but mostly I don't, even though I know it's good. But afterwards, and during it, sometimes it feels good. And this felt good. So I then made it into a weekly practice, and I wrote a 12-minute article on the train every week until Christmas. And then I carried it on after that. And then at some point I stopped getting the train as much. And I realized that the train journey, or I checked the train one day and it lasted about 12 minutes. And so I then started writing with a timer. So set the timer for 12 minutes, write while the timer's going, stop when the timer stops, proofread it once, post it online. I've been doing that for 5.5 years now. So there are about 200, it's not quite 250, like 220, 230, because there have been times when I've been on holiday and that kind of thing. 5.5 years of doing the same thing every week. And about 3 years into that, I thought it's quite hard for people to read these blogs. Like, for my mum and the 5 people that I thought might be interested in that, it'd be quite hard. LinkedIn is a really hard platform to navigate. And I thought I could put them into a book together so that people could read them. And then I was going to call it, I wrote this book in 12 minutes because it appealed to my sense of humor. And then my friend who was going to help me edit it, he said, well, can the book do what the title does? Can it be a provocation? Can it help people to stop procrastinating and start doing their thing? And it was really weird and still surprising to me to find out that it could, because in fact, I'd been just writing about what I was interested in for 3 years. And what I was interested in was my own struggle with doing the things that I wanted to do, and the coaching work that I've been doing, which is about, coaching is really just about helping people do the thing they want to do that they don't quite know how to do yet. And so I've been writing about that for 3 years. And I actually had about 80, once I'd stripped out a few that were kind of irrelevant and a few that repeated, I actually had about 80,000 words from writing 12 minutes a week for 3 years. And that was going to be one book. And actually a better idea is that it's going to be 4, including the first one, which came out last year. And so again, when we think about ambitious goals don't have to take as much time as we think. I would have never believed it was possible to write 80,000 words, 12 minutes a week for 3 years. And I would certainly have never thought that without setting out to do it, I could write a series of books that basically made coherent sense by doing that. And then what's interesting is when you I think I heard someone say, if anyone knows who said this, put it in the chat, 'cause I don't remember, that you kind of write the book that you need. And that definitely feels true for me. I wrote the book that I need, or the series of books. And also what happens when you've written a book, or when you've done any, in my experience, we've done any really concerted piece of work on one thing, is that you start seeing it everywhere. And then I started to realize that I actually do other things using essentially this habit. And the habit is something like, what's the thing you want to do? Or what's the person you want to be like? That's the frame I'm going to give you in a couple of slides' time. What's the person you want to be like in a few years? And I wanted to be like someone who wasn't stressed and anxious every time I shared something online. And then how do you practice that? If you were someone like that, what would you do every week? And what's the smallest amount of time you could do that? And when I started thinking about this, I realized that, actually, this is how I learned Spanish on Duolingo. It's essentially the same idea. It's not the most effective way to learn Spanish, but I wouldn't have a Spanish tutor that I spoke to every week. I've thought that I should for a long time. I haven't done it. Much better to be doing Duolingo every day for something like 1,270 days I'm on now, done to do no Spanish. It's how I built my business. It's how So I built a website about my favorite author. It's the blog with over 200 posts on it. It's actually, I realized as well, it's how I stay in touch with my brother. We have a default standing call every Tuesday morning because I want to be someone who speaks to my brother a lot and has a strong relationship with him. And we weren't doing that, and now we are. And that's exciting. I want to say a little bit more about the power of habits, and then just wrap up with a couple of ways that you can create habits. So I've been working on the second book in the series, which is going to be called How to Keep Going When You Want to Give Up. And it's actually not, Christina, the free one we're going to give away is the fourth one about sharing your work. That's the one that I think is like the one that if only one was out there, actually, it would be the sharing one, although it doesn't make sense to publish that one first. Because in some ways, I think the sharing is the most important. At least that was the thing that I was wrestling with. And when I've been thinking about like, what is the power of habits? I've been thinking a lot about the tortoise and the hare and how there were people who had written what felt like impossible numbers of articles when I'd written none. Like I have a friend who'd written 100. He had an article that went viral on LinkedIn, having written lessons from 100 articles on LinkedIn. I thought it was that's so many articles. And yet now I've written more than him because for some reason he stopped, like the hare, and I carried on one a week. And I think it's really important to say that somehow building a habit that builds you towards what you want to get to it gets time on your side. So instead of every week thinking that I still haven't done anything towards my idea, and that resentment and regret building, I've done this little thing towards my idea, no matter how small it is. This helped me become who I want to become. I think that is one of the things that habits really do. Like I'm someone who writes an article every week now. And once you become that, it's harder to not do it almost than it is to do it. Like if I haven't written an article, that feels weird to me. I didn't write it until Saturday last week. On Friday, I was feeling weird. I usually write it by the end of Friday. I think one of the key things that moving to habit focus, so we get this long-term goal of who we want to be or where we want to be, and then we make it into a weekly habit, is that instead of being a failure until you've achieved a goal, every time you complete the habit, you have success. The habit is do the habit. The habit is not write a good article, right? The habit is show up and write an article. And over 3 years, side effect of becoming someone who's comfortable sharing things is I've become a lot better at writing. So I've been practicing that. I've been practicing sharing, but I've also been practicing writing. And then the last thing I want to talk about is building a habit looks after future you. So here's like the two question process to build a habit that I think is really powerful. And then we'll move to some questions. And I see there's a couple in the chat. So what will the you of 2025, that's 3 years time, wish you had been practicing for 3 years? You could start with, who do you want to become? Or what's your dream? And you can start with what's your dream? And then to achieve that deep dream, who do I need to become? And if I was that person already, what would I be doing every week? Like that's a nice 3-step process, actually, which fits slightly better with what I was talking about at the start of the presentation. But I like this as which I came up with a couple of weeks ago for a talk I was giving, which is really neat, right? And kind of compressed version of that, which is, what will you of 2025 wish you had been practicing for 3 years? And then crucially, what would be the minimum viable amount of practice that would get you there? What would be just enough? I would have never guessed that 12 minutes was enough to write a book or a series of books, or even really to become somebody who is comfortable sharing things online. But actually, it absolutely has been. And it's really important to focus on just enough, because we don't want to crowd our lives too much with extra obligations and things like that. And there's a really nice Seth Godin blog called The Bannister Method, which is apparently that Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, not by trying to run a mile as fast as possible, but by trying to exactly come in just under 4 minutes. And the real difference between focusing on doing exactly enough, just enough, and no more, versus doing as much as possible. And again, thinking about that piece about overwhelm and getting distracted. For me, it's been remarkable how much I've changed through just 12 minutes a week. And then for people who want to connect more, you can find me at robbieswale.com. There's a 12-minute method Facebook group. Christina, I put a link on this slide because I imagine that we can share them with members at least somehow, and I'm happy to do that if people want them. You can find it also by just searching 12-minute method on Facebook, and love to help anyone build a habit there if we don't get to do it in the next few minutes. And like Christina said, we'll share the sharing ebook, which is provisionally titled, but I think definitely won't be called exactly this, How to Share Your Work Even When You're Scared, because for me, that's been a key part of my journey. And I wanted to give that away really at this stage. It'll be a bit different when it finally comes out later in the year, but that's available to people if they want. Of course, you can find my book on Amazon and that kind of place too. And I think that's, Christina, all I want to say in terms of the presentation. And then I guess if I stop sharing, then we could either, what should we do now?
Thank you very much, Robbie, for your wisdom there. And now we'll move on to the questions in terms of what we're doing now. There was a quote that you said, and Elisa basically found
Elisa, amazing Toni Morrison quote.
Yeah.
Yes, that's fantastic. And I know almost nothing about Toni Morrison except one of my university girlfriend made me read one of her books. So it's like who studied English. So I'm not a very literary reader, but I do remember being really affected by that Toni Morrison book. So I love that that's by her.
Cool. I've got a question from Jeff to kick off with. I'll dive into that before my ones. So Jeff has asked, how do you approach not sticking with the goals you set for creating new habits? Good question.
Yeah. So I had this so for me, Jeff, I might have shared this with you before because Jeff and I know each other, but I think like in there, Jeff, is this thing which I think is like the meta, like in a way, like one of the surprise results of the 12-minute method of this writing practice is that I have become someone who who believes they can stick to their habits. So like, that's what I was saying at the start. It's like, I didn't know I've never done anything every week for 5.5 years before this writing practice. And now that I've done that, I really know that I'm someone who could do that. And it's a bit the same with the Duolingo, although kind of it's a little less connected to my soul Duolingo than the writing practices. But it's like, that's what I was meaning earlier on when I was saying almost things feel possible now, as long as the time frame is long enough. Because I know that if I decide to do something every week for X years, I am someone who can keep that promise to myself. So I think the answer to your question, Jeff, that I would give is to build that capacity and confidence in yourself. Right? It's really advantageous. It's very useful in life to build that confidence that you can stick to the commitments you make. Now, that's not easy, right? And probably I wonder if the most original insight I've ever had, it's not actually in a 12-minute article, it's in another longer one that I wrote, was the key moment in any habit is what you decide to do when you've broken it. Mm. So there was a nice, again, Ferris, because he's in the mind, perhaps he's in the ether in this conversation now, because I've thought about him a couple of times. He had this nice thing about meditation where he said that the key moment for him with it was he used to be supposed to be concentrating on his breath or something. And I really identified with this as soon as I was exposed. So he's meditating, he's supposed to be concentrating on his breath, but he loses concentration. And then where he goes is to beat himself up because he's not focusing on his breath until he realized that essentially the rep. So he's into working out, right? So like the key moment in the working out is when you lift the weight and put it down. That's the rep. That it's not about holding the weight up, right? It's about moving the muscle. And the rep in meditation is bringing your attention back. So in fact, every time your attention drifts and you bring it back to your breathing, that's success. Like that's the thing you want to be repeating as many times as you need in the time. And I realized that with commitment, the rep is recommitting. So it's every time you slip, realizing that you're a human, you're probably gonna slip. There are gonna be some weeks or days where you don't do the thing. But what makes a difference is in those moments, just choosing the habit again and keep doing that, basically. This is what was my experience, but do follow up, Jeff, if this doesn't quite answer the question. Like my experience was, and in fact, there's a chapter I think that it must be in book 2, because I've just been editing it or like rereading it about, a week when I didn't write a 12-minute piece because I basically got freaked out on the train because it's just after maybe the Berlin terrorist attacks, and I was on the Clapham Junction train and all the trains came to a stop just outside of Clapham Junction. Turns out because the driver had pulled the emergency cord. And I just didn't write a piece that day because I was feeling I was all over the place. But afterwards, I felt like, I had that feeling of, I've broken my word to myself. I've let myself down. It's like, I should have written from that place. And the nice thing about, I was lucky really that I then kept that habit going in that moment and decided the next week to write something again. Mm-hmm. So that would be what I'd say to that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good advice there. And do you find how big or small the habit is also makes a difference to the likelihood of sticking to it, and how small is too small a habit?
Yeah. Well, I think like for that one, for that thing we've just been talking about building the capacity or the confidence and the capacity to know that you can keep your promises to yourself. Like, I don't think it matters how big. Like, if you can, like, at the end of a year, say, I did this thing every week or day for the year, it really doesn't, like, you've then become that kind of person that can do that. And it's much easier to go from there to something bigger. Like, the really important thing is to build something, in my view, but there is some research, as I understand, so in terms of goal setting and that kind of thing, is to build goals that are with, like, the risk of ambitious goals is that they actually damage confidence, right? So a goal or an action that you target, you set yourself, that you keep, builds what they call in the research self-efficacy. But I think that just basically just means confidence, right? But what is damaging to confidence is you set this ambitious goal and then you fail to meet it. So it's a really key moment in the 12-minute writing practice that I chose after the first, I did 5 in 2 weeks. And then, I'm just really grateful to me of 2016 that I then decided to go for 1 a week after that. Because if I think I'd gone for even 2 a week, certainly if I'd gone for 3 a week or 1 a day, there's no chance that I would have kept it. And I think if I'd gone for 1 every 2 weeks or 1 a month, it would have taken a lot longer to build that capacity up. So I'm really glad that I, for no reason that I can remember, chose weekly after that, that felt about right, because that then enabled it. Like, we've got to be practical. It's the tortoise and the hare thing. Like, it is better to be the hare if you can keep up being the hare forever, right? If you can keep going at hare pace forever, great, do that, right? But if you know yourself, and or you're a human, probably things will happen in life where, as the hare, you don't. And then at that point, it does pay if you can be the tortoise and have the consistency that you keep.
Yeah. And I guess, like, once a week, 12 minutes feels achievable, even if you're very drained as well. But
exactly. So it's almost like there's no, it's such a small amount of time. And I'm really, like, the 12 minutes is funny because the train from Clapham Junction to Waterloo almost never lasts 12 minutes. I discovered when I was, recently looking it up. It's a really entirely arbitrary number, but it turned out to be about right, basically, because you can basically fit it in. You can do it even when you're drained. And actually, you can, if you're doing a writing practice, you can write a pretty decent article, especially once you've practiced a few times in 12 minutes.
And out of interest, did you have an accountability buddy when you were doing that? And what's your thoughts on having accountability when it comes to habits?
Yeah, I really like it. Like, I think there's lots to be said for it, for having other people that you're kind of in the weeds with, like, and finding the right person. And I like sometimes being that for my clients, although it's not always what I do. And, you don't have to pay someone like me to have that kind of thing. I mean, if I think back, I did have my coach at the start of the practice, and then I kind of built accountability buddies, but I did it by being public with the habit. And now, that won't work for every habit that you want, but remember that although I wanted to write, it wasn't so much a writing practice that I had. It was more about being confident to share things. And, it then became a public thing. So I started off by saying, this is going to be a short series of pieces written on the train. And I would say as well, like, it was good if people are going to have a sharing practice, like, make it explicit. Like, I took the pressure off myself. So I was like, what's going to stop me here? Well, overwhelm is going to stop me. Like, and I think overwhelm would have stopped me with the book if I tried to write it in a different way. In fact, I have actually got another book that is semi-written, that is stalled. And we could talk about why that is. And it's hard when you've written a book about productivity and procrastination, not to notice all the productivity problems and procrastination that you have. But it's like, the habit takes me out of overwhelm, and so did like explicitly telling people what you're doing. So it's like, this is I'm a bit messy is now part of my brand. Like, and that's really helpful for me because I'm inside quite a perfectionist. So that's the thing, not being able to take feedback from other people we were talking about at the start. So it really helped me to be practicing being a bit messy, and to be declaring that for everyone, to be saying, this was written on the train. So all my fears as well about, like, basically people hating me, which is essentially, if I dig in to, like, why was I afraid of posting things online? It's always like being laughed at, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, no, anyone who laughs at me about a thing that I've written on the train, like, even worried me doesn't get too stressed about that, because it was written on the train. Like, what, of course there's typos in it. So that's both. So that was, like, in a way, I guess, to finish that and tie it to your question, that was making public my commitment, which I think is it's a version of an accountability buddy, or another way to think about accountability.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also interested in another way that you approach habits, which is why you're on this doing a webinar for me in the first place. Can you talk a bit about how you've used challenges to help with habit creation and how people can use that as well?
Yeah. So yeah, it's like, if you think about that question I was asked, like, what do you get from having the habit that's more important than having the habit? And sometimes it's like, I will have taken a certain amount of action. Or sometimes it's, I will have got more comfortable with something that I'm uncomfortable with. Like, those are both reasons that I might have, we might, if you look at my story or some of the other habits I've created, those are good reasons for habit. Now, at times, it's worth thinking about being the hare, right? So if we've talked about habits from the tortoise point of view, there's an argument for being the hare. The way that I tend to have approached that, and this again came from, that was a really transformational coaching engagement that I had with Joel. I think I did 2, and then later another 1. So I worked with him for about a year at the start, and it was really transformational. One of the things we did was set me a couple of challenges in my coaching business. Essentially, they were, there's an outcome that you quite want to have, and there's some behavior that will probably help with that. And what's difficult in a business is, like, you can't be sure that the thing that sometimes things are outside of your control. Sometimes, like, getting the new clients that you want, you can't actually control that. You can't be sure that what you do will lead to it. You can work out, like, what are the things that will create the conditions for those clients to appear or for my business to grow. And we set me challenges on a couple of those. So one in a coaching business, one of them is like a really good way to predict whether you have more clients or will have more clients is, are you inviting people into coaching conversations with you? Because the more people I've coached, the more chance there is that somebody who I've coached will go, oh, actually, I'd like some more coaching with Robbie. Or, oh, actually, that coaching was really useful. I bet my friend Alice would love that. And if you invite a lot of people into coaching conversations, it's likely that you'll have more coaching conversations. And so we set me a challenge of inviting 30 people into coaching conversations over the month of May. I remember that it was May. And that felt like an impossibly high number because I hadn't really invited that many people into coaching conversations before. And what was great over the course of the month is I did it. I got to 30. It got me getting creative. It got me stopping procrastinating. It got me like leaning through my discomfort. And I got good at inviting people into coaching conversations. There was one that I really remember where I was in at an event, and I'd never said it to anyone. I'd sent emails before, but I'd never said, well, we could have a coaching conversation if you like, as a gift from me. And I was having this conversation with this guy, and I was just like, it's like 3 weeks into May now. If I don't ask this guy, like, I'm not going to get to 30. I better do it. And essentially did it. And he said yes, and actually did become a client. So that actually one worked out, but it didn't really matter that. What mattered was that I practiced doing it face to face with somebody, which later meant that I was able to do that. I did another one with what I call a proposal. So it's like, it costs X pounds to work with me for Y months. Practice saying that, and there was a different challenge. And then, for these books, I decided that real success, if I asked myself that question from the start of the presentation, real success for me for the first book is not book sales. Like, first definition of success is like book sales, more clients, becoming better known, all those things. But real success is people saying, I have wanted to do this thing for a while, and I haven't been doing it. And then I came across your work, and now I've done it. So I realized that was real success for me. And then I thought about it quite a bit. And I read an article by a guy called Michael Bungay-Stanier, who wrote a book called The Coaching Habit. And he talks about how he made it a success. And he did a lot of podcasts, was basically his thing. And I thought, maybe I can, it's like, I'm always looking in my business for where I can kind of solve a few problems at once. And I thought, maybe there's a challenge here. And I decided that I would challenge myself to be on 100 podcasts with a little asterisk there. Because when you're making a challenge like this, you've got to make the rules count for you. 100 podcasts in 2022. So if anyone who's watching either here now or later knows of any podcast or has a podcast and would like me on, please let me know, because I'm on about 22, I think now, and it's May. So that doesn't quite add up. So I've got like 40 something confirmations. So it's like, that feels more on the way, but I'm going to need to get going in the second half of the year. And it's been amazing because it has it started this conversation, which led to me doing this webinar with you, right? I told you at some point I was doing this challenge, and you said, oh, you had this idea. Does a webinar count? The answer is yes, Christina, of course it does. I need to reach my 100. So things like this definitely count. And of course it does, because there's people here now and it'll be recorded. So it's the same, but I realized that so do events. They count as well, because people are there and I'm talking about my stories and all that kind of thing. And maybe they'll be inspired to start their thing that they hadn't otherwise started, or to build a habit that can make a difference. But it also, like I say, it gets me out of my own way. It gets me creative. It gets me asking for help, which I'm quite bad at as well. So it's like, if I don't ask for help on this, there's no way that I'm going to find the thing. And what's been really nice is people I know who have podcasts that I've forgotten about have come out of the woodwork and said, yes. People have said, oh, I don't have a podcast, but you should speak to these people. And some of those are the ones that I've done already. People are saying, you should check out this Facebook group, and lots of help. That I'm quite like what my friend, again, my mentor, Robert, who's in mind a little bit, he calls dysfunctional independence. Like I have a bit of that sometimes, and all the time, in fact. And so asking for help is really useful. And then I was just thinking today, actually, one of the other, it's a bit different for us because we know each other, but one of the other real benefits, you get unexpected benefits from these things, these challenges, where I've practiced speaking about my ideas a lot, and I've connected with a whole load of interesting people who have podcasts or host events. And I've had to say yes to things that I would have normally been uncomfortable saying yes to. Like I'm doing a talk in a couple of weeks, like I was saying to you before we started, for a part of Deutsche Bank. And I just don't think I would have got in there or said yes once the offer had come, if I hadn't been thinking so much about all this. So I'm a big fan, as well as the habits piece, of getting creative and setting ourselves a challenge. Really useful. Like on the third one, I can do that by myself, but really useful if you're going to set yourself a challenge to have some people to do that with. And you've got to hold it playfully. Yeah. And it's got to be just stretching enough to be like, I don't think I can do this, but possible enough. Like if I couldn't do 150, because that would be averaging 3 a week, which would just feel like too much. But 100 feels like, I don't think I can do that, but I might be able to. So it's about right.
Yeah, no, I really love the idea of challenges as a way of helping get habits and goals going. Yeah. And like, it's sort of, because I guess it's very easy to give up, but if you've gamified it, it's like to win the game. It sort of forces you to get your reps in that you might not do.
And it's good to have like when I did my proposals one, I had like the Blue Peter back in the day, they'd have like a thermometer thing, which gets colored in as people donate. I had one of those. And it's good to have, like, to make it, to really gamify it, like you say. Like at the moment, I decided to make the podcast one public. So I've just got a post on my website, which has got where you can find the podcast, but also follow how it's going. I don't know if anyone's checking that, but for me, it's important because every time I do one, I'll do it after we've had this call. I'll go on there and I'll add this to the list. And it's like, I'm getting, feel the progress, just like tick off. Yeah. Have I written an article this week? Tick. And in fact, the funny thing, Christina, is with the podcast challenge, and I find this hilarious. I was getting really I'd agreed to do it. I said I'd do it. I might have even posted about it online to make sure I would do it. And then I started to feel incredibly overwhelmed and stressed out. And I was like, I'm never going to do it. And I had all those feelings that I have when I'm frightened and worried. And then I was like, oh, but I know how to deal with this, right? Because I've just written a book about how to deal with this. And so what I did was I put in 30 minutes a week in my calendar. So enough work on the 100 podcast challenge for me is 30 minutes work on it a week. And if I do that, I don't need to feel stressed about, am I doing enough? Now, and it's like, it made an almost instantaneous difference. And then I could just file all the emails that were to do with it, put away my list of potential podcasts that I could approach until, Tuesday afternoon. And then on Tuesday afternoon, I need to do it later. I haven't done it today. Sit down for 30 minutes, I get a timer out like I do with my article, and I do 30 minutes work on it. And that is keeping it ticking over. Now, the truth is, now that I'm saying this, I'm going to need to book myself at least a couple of half days to, like, if I'm going to pick up the pace and have a chance of getting to 100. But most weeks, if I'm doing 30 minutes work on it, to schedule these things, to do the little bits of prep work, to plan put the slides together, although I didn't do that in the 30 minutes, because like I said, I did it when someone cancelled on me. It was really funny to notice that actually I was getting overwhelmed again, but I know what to do now. So it's the Toni Morrison thing, right? Write the book that you need, and then you've got that book. Every time you work, you're having the same struggle that you always have.
That's a great tip in general, I guess, for whether someone's doing a challenge or a habit, of that scheduling it in.
Yeah.
Getting it in your calendar.
Yeah. And know when the deadline is for the weekly thing as well. Like, you can choose when it is, but choose one so that you know when you've succeeded or not. And, for me, I need the deadline. So like for the writing, it used to be Wednesday because I used to do it as part of a writing group for a couple of years of it, but it's usually Friday, but the actual deadline is Sunday. So I try and do it by the end of my working week on Friday. But like for various reasons, I was away last week. I ended up doing it on Saturday, but there was no way I was getting to Sunday without doing it.
So you've mentioned a few things there that can help increase the chances of somebody sticking with a habit. So yeah, putting a time in every week, keeping it quite small. Are there any other, maybe having a challenge? Are there any other things that would help increase the chances of someone sticking to a habit?
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple of others probably that we've mentioned. Yeah. Manageable amounts of time, like minimum possible time. I just really think that's important. We're all busy. Yep. The world keeps asking more of us. And I think really connecting it to the long term, like have the long-term vision and then hold it lightly. Know who you want to become. Because then it's like, you know, I think my own personal bloody mindedness, or like, I don't know what it was really. Like, I think I'd just been maybe it was that I'd been, so maybe there's be surrounded by the right people is one. Like, I think I'd been like, not necessarily literally surrounded, but I've been in the space. I've been reading Stephen Pressfield. I've been, you know, listening to the right podcasts. And so I kind of knew the ways that people fall down on habits. And I made sure that I wasn't going to. Like when you're starting a habit, if it's going to be something you share, commit to doing at least 5 or 6 before you give up. So that like by the time, because otherwise you give up after 1 because it'll be rubbish, the first one. It will, like it, you know, it'll never be as good, but you will get better. And after you've done 5, 6, like that's a good amount of time. But I think connecting it to who you want to become is a really powerful thing to do. So it's like, if I want to become, in my case, it would have been like, if I want to become someone who shares things they've made publicly without feeling super stressed, I have to practice sharing things that I've made, because that's how I'll get there. I guess the piece that I didn't really talk about today is, as time's gone on, I've just kind of, I really think that talent is given far too much weighting in our society. There's an amazing book called, there's a few books about it, but the one that I read was called Bounce by Matthew Syed, who was a table tennis player, now a journalist. I read that. I thought his arguments for how talent plays a much smaller role than we think are really salient. And that makes things feel really different to me, because then it's like, oh, if I just practice enough, again, kind of, I can at least improve how good I am at things. So remembering why I'm practicing something is another, I think, really good one to try and stick to the habits. And if you can create that picture of where you want to be in 5 years or who you want to be in 5 years, I think that's another nice way to stick to it.
Another question on that. So if you've got this vision of who you want to be in 5 years, who you want to become, there's probably quite a few different elements that you want to improve. Like it might be your health, career, and all of those require lots of different habits. So how have you got any tips on deciding which habit to pick and how many to do at once, and like not getting overwhelmed by trying to do a million new habits?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, such a good question, Christina. Such a good point. I mean, you probably hear it in the way that I'm speaking, and you know this about me already, but people who are here can probably hear it. Like I love to collect other people's ideas and then share them. Like that's one of my strengths that I've learned over the years. So the 2 that come to mind are, well, 3 maybe. So one is like, I think our intuition often knows. So that's it. Like, you know, honestly, if you look at it, like make it manageable for yourself. Don't try and build in 10 at once. I'd probably start 1 at a time, because once, like I said, there's a chapter in How to Start When You're Stuck where I kind of realized I'd become someone who writes, and that it was almost easier at that point. Like my sense of self was so different that it was like halfway through a drink in a pub on Friday night that I realized I hadn't written an article. And it was like, well, obviously when I get home, I'm going to write an article. Now that's really different to who I was 3 years earlier, when that wouldn't have even occurred to me. If I hadn't written an article I thought I was going to write, you know, that wouldn't have even been a part of who I was. I wouldn't have even crossed my mind that I would do it when I got home, right? And it's like, so give yourself the chance by doing 1 at a time is a good thing. And then once it's like easier for you to do it than not do it, and that sometimes takes a while, you could choose that only then will you add a new one. It could be useful to think like, there's a question from The One Thing by Gary Keller, what's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will become easier or unnecessary? So if you've got like 10 habits that you might want to start, look for which of them enable the most good things, have the most leverage, and start there. And then every year, the goal setting exercise that I do comes from a possibly apocryphal story. I don't know about Warren Buffett. You can find it there's a James Clear blog about it. If you just search James Clear, Warren Buffett, 2 lists or something like that. And it's about how Buffett works with the pilot of his private jet. So it's a story we can all identify with on the pilot's career ambitions. And I'm going to give you the punchline now. So mute me if you don't want to hear it and you want to do the exercise in full. But essentially it is, he gets him to write out 25 things that he wants to achieve in his career. So you could write out the 25 things you want to achieve to get to your vision, and then work out which the 5 most important ones are. And then those 5 become the 5 things you focus on. The other 20 become your avoid at all costs list until you've done the first 5. Because mostly people don't get distracted by the stuff they don't think is important. They get distracted by the stuff that isn't quite as important as the most important stuff.
So true.
And you end up doing some good things that aren't the best things you could be doing. And so it could be that. And if you think about that, that's an 80-20 analysis on, 5 out of 25. That's an 80-20 analysis on what you might want to achieve. So it's like, make the choice. So it's like we've talked about, it's a nice question because it's like, it does provide a missing link, doesn't it? We've got the vision. Then it's like, how do you make the choice about where you focus? And then we've talked quite a bit about how do you maintain that focus, which a bit like, and hopefully that might answer the question that somebody had earlier. Elisa, was it? The 8,253,000 things.
Yeah.
It's like, there's some things for you to play with there.
Yep. Some excellent tips from goals, habits, all the way around there. So thanks, Robbie. If anyone has any final questions, do post in the chat. Any final words of wisdom that you wanted to share before we wrap up?
well, maybe, yeah. To the piece that I didn't say there that I could have also been an answer to that question. So it has been very powerful to me to remember that Stephen Pressfield idea that the place where we feel the most resistance is the place that is most important for our soul's evolution. So essentially, that's how I chose the habit to focus on. It's like, where am I feeling the most resistance? And I mean, I find it hard to imagine that I could have found something that has had more benefits for me as a human than that 12-minute writing practice. And I couldn't have planned it, but it's changed how I think. It's changed how I write. It's changed how I think about myself, because I'm now someone, like I said, who can write things about pretty much anything, and now don't feel the fear that I used to have every time I post. It used to be that procrastination hovering over the post button, and I just don't get that in the same way anymore. And I've become this person who basically believes that I can do things now because I've kept that habit going for so long. So it does feel like that thing that I was resisting was pretty important for my soul's evolution. So you could, the really courageous answer to your question about what to choose is to think about what is like the thing you're resisting the most, and then choose that.
That mentioned Tim Ferriss a lot of times, where he's got an exercise that he mentions about if you don't know what to do for the day and you're really overwhelmed, it's like just shut your computer, get a pen and paper. What are the 3 things that are making you most uncomfortable?
Yeah.
And that's probably the thing. Pick one of those, block out 2 to 3 hours just to do the task that makes you feel most uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It sounds
like torture, both of those things, but the truth is it's wonderful, because there's few, I don't know, I think there's few human qualities as admirable as courage. And so when it feels amazing, when you've done those things, and you sit down going like I had one last week. I realized I'd really messed up 2 weeks ago. I'd really messed up something. I'd actually said something to someone that was probably in breach of a contract that I had, and I was feeling terrible about it. And I knew what I had to do, which was call the person I'd said it to. And years ago, I would have found it much harder, but it's like I called them and 2 things happened. One is they resolved my query for me and made me, it wasn't as bad as I thought, and it was okay. And the other is afterwards, I was like, can't believe I just called that person and told them what was going on. It would have felt really uncomfortable to me, but I knew I had to do it, and it was that kind of thing. And after you've done that kind of thing, it's a bit like after going on a workout or climbing a mountain, or it's like you do grow basically as a human by facing down those things. And you do, one of my mentors, he says, confidence is a result of taking action, not a requirement to take it. So never wait for confidence.
Mm-hmm.
But you do feel more confident after you've practiced things. And I guess we've been talking about practicing a lot, haven't we, in the challenge, in the habit, but also in like practice doing the things that make you uncomfortable. It's a scary thing to do, but it's a great practice to make yourself go through sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. All about the discomfort to grow. I've just seen that it's 3, so I will wrap it up at this point. Thank you so much, Robbie. Packed so much into that hour. I really appreciate your time. As I said, we'll share this with the recording with everyone, and the link to get your draft book as well.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for having me and helping me with my 100 podcast challenge.
I've got faith you'll make it. Got a while to go by the sounds of it, but
yeah,
you've got time. Great. Thanks, Robbie. And thanks everyone for joining in the last hour. Have a good afternoon.
Cheers. Bye.